Welcome back to the deep dive. We often think of war as something you see in history books or, on the news.
Right, something distant.
But there is a war, an invisible war happening right now on your skin and your gut. It is this constant biological arms race.
It absolutely is. And it's the oldest war in history. The human body versus the microbial world. And for most of history, we were losing pretty badly.
Until we learned how to fight smarter.
Correct.
How to, stack the deck in our favor.
Exactly.
So today, that's our mission. We're unpacking the human strategy guide for this war. First, how we train the body for a fight before the enemy even arrives. That's vaccines.
And then the chemical weapons we deploy when our defenses are breached, the antimicrobials.
And our source material, our field manual for this, is Chapter 5 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews. Microbiology, 4th edition.
A classic.
It is, but it's also very dense. So before we dive in, why this chapter? Why is this more than just, a long list of drugs to memorize for an exam?
Because this is the why. It's the absolute cornerstone of clinical medicine. Understanding these mechanisms is what separates a technician from a clinician. I mean, anyone can memorize a drug for an infection, but to understand why a vaccine can stop meningitis in a baby,
Right.
or why we can cure some infections but not others, that's about understanding the rules of engagement.
The rules of engagement. I like that. So let's start with those rules, with the first line of defense. Immunization. The text splits this into passive and active.
Right.
I want to start with passive because it sounds a little like getting a cheat code.
It really is. Think of it like hiring mercenaries for an immediate threat.
You're just bringing in outside help.
Exactly. You're taking preformed antibodies, immunoglobulins, from a donor who's already immune, and you inject them straight into a patient. Figure 5.2 in the text shows this perfectly. The antibody levels just spike instantly.
So there's no waiting period.
Zero lag time. This is for the oh-no moments. You get bitten by a potentially rabid animal. You can't wait 2 weeks for your body to learn how to fight rabies.
It'd be too late by then.
Way too late. So we inject rabies immunoglobulin right there. Boom, instant shield.
The text also brings up hepatitis B.
Yep, think of a healthcare worker with a needle stick or a baby born to an infected mother. You give them that immediate protection, but there's a catch.
The mercenaries go home eventually.
They do. Because your body didn't make those antibodies, it has no memory of how to produce them. Once they degrade, that shield is gone, you're vulnerable again.
Which I assume leads us to the teach a man to fish approach, active immunization.
This is the goal. This is the gold standard. We're actually teaching your immune system to build its own army, its own weapons factory.
It's slower, I guess.
It is. It takes a few weeks to really get going, but because you're creating your own memory B cells and T cells, that protection can last for years, sometimes a lifetime.
So how do we do it? The text lays out a few different strategies: live-attenuated, killed, and then subunit vaccines. Let's start with live-attenuated. It sounds, risky.
It's a trade-off. It's always a trade-off between safety and how strong the response is. A live attenuated vaccine, like for measles, mumps, rubella, the MMR, it uses a real virus that's just been weakened in a lab.
So it's still alive, and it replicates in your body.
Yes, and that's the key.
Yeah.
Because it replicates, it looks like a real, full-blown invasion to your immune system. You get a massive, powerful response, both antibodies and cellular immunity. It's incredibly effective.
But the risk?
The risk is tiny, but it's there. Because it's alive, it could theoretically mutate back to its dangerous form, and you absolutely cannot give it to someone who is immunocompromised.
Okay, so that's where the killed vaccines come in.
Exactly. Here, the virus or bacterium has been killed with heat or chemicals. It cannot replicate. There is zero chance of it causing an infection.
But I'm guessing the immune response is weaker.
Much weaker. Your body sees it, but it doesn't panic in the same way. So you often need multiple doses, you need boosters to keep that memory fresh. Think of your tetanus shot every 10 years.
Right, okay. Now, there was one concept in here that felt like a huge breakthrough. The text calls them conjugate vaccines. It seemed to solve a really specific, really dangerous problem with infants.
Oh, this is such a high-yield concept. It's a brilliant point of immunology. So you have to understand that some of the most dangerous bacteria, like Haemophilus influenza type B or Hib, they wear a disguise, a coat made of polysaccharides, just complex sugars.
And an adult immune system can see that sugar coat and attack it.
Yes, but an infant's immune system, say under 18 months, is effectively blind to it. These sugars are what we call T-cell independent antigens. They just don't trigger the right kind of alarm in a baby.
So the bacteria could just waltz right in, and the baby's immune system wouldn't do anything.
Not enough, anyway. And this was causing Thousands of cases of meningitis. It was devastating.
So what was the fix? How did they solve this sugar problem?
They got clever. They used conjugation. They took that invisible sugar molecule and chemically glued it, conjugated it to a big, loud, obvious protein like a diphtheria toxoid.
So you attach the weak signal to a strong one.
Precisely. The infant's immune system sees the protein, freaks out, mounts a huge T-cell response, and in the process, it learns to recognize the sugar that's attached to it. You're tricking it.
The result is in figure 5.3, and it's stunning. You see the graph of meningitis cases before 1987, and it's terrifyingly high.
And then the conjugate vaccine is introduced.
And the line just falls off a cliff. It goes to almost zero.
It's one of the greatest public health victories of the 20th century. It saved so many lives.
Incredible. So let's do a quick run through of some other bacterial vaccines mentioned. Tetanus and diphtheria. The text says we're not fighting the bug itself.
Correct. With those, we're making a toxoid vaccine. The bacteria do their damage by releasing a toxin, so the vaccine teaches your body to make antibodies that neutralize the toxin. You're building an antidote.
And pertussis, whooping cough.
Yeah.
There was a change from a whole cell to a cellular vaccine.
Yeah, the old one worked, but it caused a lot of side effects like high fevers in kids. The acellular one just uses a few purified proteins from the bacterium. It's much gentler, but just as effective.
Okay, let's switch to the viral side. The book brings up a classic debate. Polio. Salk versus Sabin.
Ah, the big one. It's the perfect illustration of that live versus killed vaccine trade-off.
Salk was the killed vaccine.
Right.
Injected.
Right. It's inactivated, perfectly safe, no risk of causing polio. It gives you great antibodies in your blood.
But Sabin's was different.
Sabin's was the live-attenuated one. You took it orally on a sugar cube. And because it's oral, it sets up immunity in your gut.
Why does that matter?
Because that's where the virus replicates and spreads from. So the Sabin vaccine not only protected you from getting sick, it stopped you from spreading it to others. It was better for wiping out the disease.
So why don't we use it in the U.S. anymore?
Because of that tiny risk, about 1 in every 2.4 million doses could revert and cause vaccine-associated polio. Once we had eliminated wild polio, that risk, however small, just wasn't acceptable anymore. So we switched the Salk vaccine exclusively for maximum safety.
That makes perfect sense. What about influenza? Why do I have to get a flu shot every single year?
Because the flu is a master of disguise. The text calls it antigenic drift.
It's a shapeshifter.
It is. It constantly makes tiny changes to its surface proteins. So the antibodies you made last year don't recognize this year's model. Measles is stable. It wears the same coat year after year. The flu gets a new wardrobe every season.
Okay, so our shield is up. We've trained our immune system. But sometimes the enemy gets through, the walls are breached. Now we need the heavy artillery, antimicrobials.
Right. And before we talk about any specific drug, the single most important concept, the golden rule, is selective toxicity.
Kill the bug, not the patient.
That's the holy grail. Find something the bacteria has that we don't and attack that.
And the text says there are two main approaches here. Bacteriostatic versus bactericidal.
Yep, look at figure 5.9. Bacteriostatic drugs. They just stop the bacteria from multiplying. The growth curve goes flat.
So you're basically just holding them in place.
You're hitting the pause button, and then you let the patient's own immune system come in and clean up the mess.
And bactericidal.
That's the executioner. Those drugs actively kill the bacteria. The curve goes down. You need these for really serious infections, like meningitis, or for anyone who's immunocompromised and can't clean up the mess on their own.
All right, let's open the armory. The book organizes them by their target. Target 1, the cell wall.
This is the most obvious target. Bacteria have a rigid cell wall made of peptidoglycan. We don't.
Our cells are just squishy.
Exactly. So drugs like penicillin and the cephalosporins, the beta-lactams, they work by breaking the links in that cell wall. The internal pressure of the bacterium causes it to just pop. It explodes.
But something like mycoplasma.
Totally ineffective. Because mycoplasma doesn't have a cell wall. You can't knock down a wall that isn't there.
Let's talk about the cephalosporins for a second. Figure 5.12 shows them evolving from first to fifth generation. What's happening there?
They're getting broader. The first generation is great against gram-positives. As you go up the generations, they get better and better at killing gram-negatives, and by the time you get to the fifth, you're killing superbugs like MRSA.
And then there's vancomycin. The book calls it the heavy artillery for gram-positives.
It is. It also hits the cell wall, but its limitation is its size. Vancomycin is a huge molecule. It literally can't fit through the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria. So it's a dedicated gram-positive killer. It's our main weapon against MRSA.
Okay, target 2, The protein factory, the ribosomes.
Another great example of selective toxicity. Bacterial ribosomes are a different size and shape than ours, so we can design drugs that jam their protein production line without affecting our own.
The text mentions tetracyclines, and then aminoglycosides with a really interesting clinical note about oxygen.
Yes, this is a classic. Aminoglycosides need an oxygen-dependent pump to get inside the bacterial cell.
So if there's no oxygen,
The drug can't get in the door. So they're completely useless against anaerobic bacteria, the kind you find in, say, a deep abdominal abscess where there's no oxygen.
that's fascinating. It's all about access. Moving on. Target 3. DNA and metabolism.
Now we're getting into their core programming. The fluoroquinolones, like Cipro, they inhibit an enzyme called DNA gyrase.
What does that do?
Think of it like the enzyme that unzips the DNA so it can be copied. These drugs jam the zipper. The bacterium can't replicate its DNA, so it can't divide.
And then there's the combo drug, TMP-SMX,
Oh, the
which shows how it hits 2 steps in one pathway.
The double tap. Bacteria have to make their own folic acid. We get it from our diet. This drug hits 2 different enzymes in the folic acid production line. It's a synergistic knockout punch.
So we have all these amazing weapons, but the bacteria are fighting back. Drug resistance, how are they doing it?
A few main ways. Sometimes it's just a random mutation, but more often it's acquired resistance. They can literally pass genes to each other on little pieces of DNA called plasmids.
They're downloading cheat codes from each other.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the cheats are pretty clever. One is target modification. They just change the shape of the lock so our drug key doesn't fit anymore.
Okay, what else?
Enzymatic inactivation. The bacteria builds an enzyme that specifically finds our antibiotic and just chews it up, destroys it. That's what beta-lactamase does to penicillin.
And the third one, which figure 5.1 illustrates, is the efflux pump.
This one is amazing. The antibiotic gets into the cell, but the bacterium has evolved a pump, like a little bouncer at a club, that just grabs the drug and physically throws it back outside.
That's incredible and terrifying.
It really is.
So finally, let's talk about antivirals. Why is this section so much harder? Why don't we have as many antivirals as we do antibiotics?
Because the virus is using our own machinery to replicate. It's living inside our cells. It's incredibly hard to find a drug that kills the virus without killing our own cells. The call is coming from inside the house.
But we've had some successes. Herpes, HIV.
Right. For herpes, we use nucleoside analogs. They're basically fake DNA building blocks. The virus tries to use them to replicate, and it breaks the whole process.
And for HIV, the text emphasizes the cocktail approach.
Yeah, heart. Because HIV mutates so quickly, you have to hit it with multiple drugs at once. You block it from entering the cell, from copying its RNA to DNA, from integrating into our genome, all at the same time. You suppress it, but you can't quite cure it.
But hepatitis C you can cure now.
Yes. This is one of the biggest medical stories of the last decade. The new direct-acting antivirals can actually eliminate the virus completely, a true cure. It's a game changer.
So to wrap this all up, we've gone from borrowing immunity to training our own, using weakened bugs, dead bugs, and even these really clever conjugate tricks.
Then we looked at the arsenal. Smashing cell walls, jamming protein factories, breaking DNA.
And all the while, the enemy is adapting, changing its locks, shooting down our missiles, and hiring bouncers to throw our drugs out.
It just highlights that this is a dynamic, constant evolutionary battle.
Which brings us to a final thought. I want to go back to that efflux pump.
It's a haunting idea.
It is. We spend billions of dollars to design a perfect magic bullet to hit a specific target. And the bacteria's response is just to evolve a generic garbage disposal to throw it out. Makes you wonder, are we running out of targets? Or is the future not about finding new bullets, but about finding a way to sabotage the pump itself?
That's the question that will define infectious disease for the next 50 years.
Something to think about. That's it for this deep dive into the invisible war. Thanks for listening.
Stay curious and wash your hands.
This has been the Last Minute Lecture Team, signing off.